Thank you all for coming today. One of the purposes of this lecture series was to think about whether there's something or anything that can bring us all together in this nation. Whether, or put differently, whether there are any shared values or shared understandings that can unite us. Because obviously we're so divided and in a country that's so inherently in conflict that it might seem like there's nothing that could bring us together. I wanted to kind of put that position aside for a moment and suggest that maybe democracy could be something that could bring us together. And I was having a conversation with Curtis several weeks ago where he had thought that we can think of democracy as a unifier. And I thought that that was an insightful point to consider. That democracy is something that we all can rally behind. There's some support to suggest that democracy can kind of bring us together. For example, this is a Pew Research Center poll from 2018, and on the left, the people surveyed were asked about different democratic ideals or democratic values, and they were asked, are these important to you? And as you can see, 82, 83, 84% of the respondents said not only that democracy was important, but that it was very important. And on a survey, this is a national survey, getting 80% to say something, that's a very high number. I don't mean to suggest that this proves anything. The survey doesn't prove anything, but it does suggest that maybe there's something to the idea that in such a society that's so conflicted, that politically, that maybe democracy is something that can kind of pull us together. On the other hand, I can provide some information that is in opposition to this. For example, we need to look no further than the last election in California in June 2022, and we can see here, kind of on the upper right, that just in our own county, that only 29% of the people who are registered voters decided to vote, which means that 71% of the people who could voted didn't vote. So that suggests that democracy is not something that everyone cares about, because if democracy was something that everyone cared about, we would have a lot more than 29% of the eligible voters voting in an election. We could spend, an hour having an interesting discussion on whether democracy is something that we all care about or democracy is not something we all care about. And that could be interesting. I think in the end it would be inconclusive. But for that reason, we can't really, draw that conclusion. But I will say this. Democracy is something that we all should care about. It's something that we ought to care about as a nation. So that's going to be the starting point for my presentation. My talk is going to fall into two parts. And in the first part, I'm going to talk about democracy and what democracy means. And in the second part, I'm going to talk about a feature in American governance, which is called gerrymandering. And then I'm going to try to tie together, using our discussion, the connection between democracy and gerrymandering. And now maybe gerrymandering is something that you've heard about. Maybe it's something that you're not that familiar with. But people who have heard of gerrymandering, many of them are quite upset with it. For example, I'm going to show a few pictures from some political protests. Here we have a protester talking about how gerrymandering is kind of like cheating or making the person's vote not very meaningful. Or here we have another sign saying stop voter suppression, and then referring to the word gerrymandering to suggest that, in a broad sense, that gerrymandering is a type of voter suppression. And here, more directly, the person is saying that in his protest that gerrymandering is like rigging democracy. Now, I wanted to focus in on this last issue most directly in the sense of, does gerrymandering rig democracy? Does it violate democracy? Is that true? Or is it the case that that's not true? So, for example, I phrased the question like this. I want to talk about a specific type of gerrymandering called partisan gerrymandering, but I'm phrasing the question as, does partisan gerrymandering violate democracy? And is that true? Or is that wrong? That it's not true, and that partisan gerrymandering, it's just a kind of democratic politics. It doesn't really violate democracy. So that's going to kind of be what I'm going to focus on. I will say that there is a political scientist who's named Stephen Medvick, and he's written about gerrymandering in insightful ways. And he encourages his readers to think about gerrymandering in connection to competing views of democracy. So I kind of would like to work off that idea, although the way I'm discussing democracy is a little bit different than the way Medvick did. But, so, let me start. How would you start? Democracy. What is democracy? That's such a huge question. It's a difficult question. I wanted to suggest that we start here in thinking about a political theorist whose name was Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt lived in the 20th century, and she died in 1975. Arendt wrote many very influential works on a wide range of political topics, but democracy was something that she was very passionate about. So I wanted to bring her up because I thought that you would find her insightful. Arendt's starting point was that when thinking about politics, think of politics as an activity. That for her, politics is an activity. It's something that we do. And democracy, more specifically, is an activity. And she saw that we should think of our society as arranged in the private realm and in the public realm. And both realms are really important, but it's the public realm which is the realm of politics. And in the public realm, it's the place where we can exercise speech and free speech. And it's the place where we can take action. That's the political realm. And for her, democratic action is actions in groups. That's what makes your action powerful. Arendt also had this very important idea, which is that we achieve freedom through politics, that we're free through politics. And what she meant by that is that by participating in politics, that it enables us to be free, and it enables us to be truly human. So, like, for example, participating in politics by voting, participating in politics by engaging in political organizations on campus, participating in politics by writing a letter to your legislature, staying very informed about political issues that you debate with your peers, perhaps running for office. All of those, and probably a number of other ways, involve participating in politics. And she felt that that's what made you free, that you're free through politics. On the flip side, if there was persons who felt like politics is something over here that I want to stay away from, I just want to focus on my friends and family and job and school, she would say that person is denying himself or herself their freedom. So participating in the democratic politics is something that makes us free, and so it's something that's very, very meaningful. It means something. So that was another key point. Another point about Arendt is that she felt that politics is the place of opinions. So in the political realm, it's the place where we want to hear a lot of different opinions of people. We don't want a situation where one viewpoint dominates and kind of stifles everybody. She referred to the term innumerable perspectives. That in politics, we want to hear different perspectives of people. And so, for example, let's say that there was a brilliant philosopher, and the philosopher felt that he or she understood the meaning of justice. From an Arendtian perspective, when that person enters the realm of democratic politics, his or her opinion, her viewpoint of justice just becomes one opinion, because we want to hear lots of different people's opinions and not having one dominate. So, in sum, for Arendt, a democratic politics would be a great politics because it's a politics where people can participate actively, exercise power and free speech, become free, and hear a lot of different people's perspectives. So, that's Arendt for now. There's probably no way that we could talk about what democracy is unless we also brought in to our discussion John Lewis. And John Lewis spent his whole life as a civil rights activist, and Lewis served as a member of Congress for 33 years. And what was so central for Lewis was, when thinking about democracy, was the importance of voting. It was just the key to democratic processes because voting was a way you could change things, and it was also nonviolent. Before he passed away, which was in July 2020, shortly before, he wrote an essay. And he asked that after he passed, if this essay could be published. And it was in newspapers and other places. And the title of the essay was, "Together, You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation." And when I read his essay, when he talked about nonviolence and voting and combating injustices, I felt that he was saying that the soul of our nation is democracy. That's really kind of what we need to redeem as a country to kind of bring us together. And I quoted from his essay where the first part he talks about that idea that the vote is the most powerful nonviolent change you can have in a democratic society, which is extremely important. But also the latter part, when he said we need to use the vote because it's not guaranteed. And that's true. People can take it away. So for that reason, all of us, we need to be really on top of what's going on with voting and to make sure that people don't take away our voting rights. So I think that Lewis is like Arendt in the sense that Lewis, of course, also believes that democracy is an activity, but I think Lewis really brings out the importance of voting in a democracy and thinking of everyone's vote as counting, and the vote needs to count equally for everybody to protect your role in a democracy. I also want to look, in addition to these two people, I wanted to comment on our Constitution. So our Constitution has two really important amendments, and we're all familiar with the First Amendment and First Amendment freedoms like speech and the right to petition and the right to assembly and the right to free press. Those are so important for a democracy because that's how kind of we can express ourselves and individually and together in terms for a political voice. It's also the case that when we vote and we're casting our voter preference, and we're doing that, that's like exercising free speech. We speak when we vote. So the First Amendment is obviously crucial. But I also wanted to add that there's another amendment to the Constitution, which is the 14th Amendment. And sometimes the 14th Amendment doesn't get as much attention in schools and so on, but it's just as important. The 14th Amendment has a clause, and the clause is called the Equal Protection Clause. And the Equal Protection Clause says this: no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. As a side note, that's the only place in the Constitution that says the word equal. It only says it once. But what it's meant to mean is that the laws are supposed to protect all of us equally. And that might sound very idealistic, but according to our Constitution, the laws are supposed to treat us all equally and not favor one group of persons over the others. But it also means this, that we're supposed to have equality in the political process. So one person shouldn't count more than another person when we're thinking about our democratic processes. And that's, becomes very important when thinking about, what democracy is. One person shouldn't count more than the other person. So far, the three views that I presented, the Arendtian model, the Lewis way of it, and the Constitution, thinking of democracy, kind of fall in a general category, a general group, like focusing on that there's freedom, that there's equality, that there's meaningfulness in the political system, that you can achieve freedom through participating in politics. They kind of have to do with like what the substance of justice, what the substance of democracy is, what we have when we have democracy. But there is another view that kind of goes in a different direction. And this view, I'm giving it kind of using my own words and my own name for it. It's a view that I read fairly frequently in Supreme Court opinions by some of the justices. And this angle on democracy, I'm calling the deference to elected lawmakers argument. And this kind of goes in a different direction. And according to this position, democracy means that we show deference to, which means we give respect to, the decisions made by democratically elected lawmakers. And that's democracy. It's not so much whether the decision made gave us freedom or gave us equality. It's more about this. Do we have elections? Do we have reasonable requirements to vote? And then voters at the elections elect representatives, and those representatives make decisions? And then are those representatives accountable for re-election? And if the answer is yes, then you have a representative democracy. That's democracy. Voted, elected them, they made their decisions, then they have to be accountable in the next election. Then that's democracy. Now, those legislators might make decisions you like. They might make decisions that promote freedom or promote equality. On the flip side, they might do things that take them away. They might do things that take away your freedoms and take away your equality. But if you don't like what they did, then don't vote for them the next time. And that's kind of a different way of thinking of democracy. You're showing respect to the fact that they were elected through the elections. Okay, so that's, okay. Does anyone know what that is? And you can shout out or say out. Does anyone know what that is? Or I think I heard. Yeah, very good, very good. You're correct. It's a salamander. You might be wondering why that relates. I wanted to talk about, move into my points about gerrymandering, and it actually relates to the salamander. It's not a fluke. So I was going to talk a little bit about where gerrymandering came from and make that connection. So now I'm in the second part of the talk. So gerrymandering, a feature of American politics. On the left here, we have a portrait of a founding father whose name was Elbridge Gerry, who subsequently became a governor of Massachusetts. And then we have in the middle here, this is actually a political cartoon. And what happened is that Elbridge Gerry oversaw the drawing of legislative district lines for state senator. And I'm going to be explaining that a little bit more shortly. But so this is a cartoon of the area in Boston. And according to the Constitution, district lines for elected representatives at the state level in Congress have to be redrawn every 10 years. That's known as redistricting. And when Gerry oversaw the drawing of the lines, it was drawn like this, according to the cartoonist, and the cartoonist was correct. This is one district, and the cartoonist was trying to make fun of Elbridge Gerry by saying you drew it like a salamander. So I'm going to call my cartoon the Gerrymander. Get it? Jerry, salamander. Okay. I don't know if you think that's funny, but in 1812 they thought that was funny, or some people thought it was funny. So the name stuck. So what it meant was every time legislators afterwards started to draw district boundary lines in ways that looked kind of funny in the sense that they weren't drawn in a way that was compact. They were kind of drawn in a drawn-out way, or that in this case looks like a salamander, that's called gerrymandering. So, gerrymandering, let me give you a more academic definition. This is going back to Stephen Medvick again. A definition that one could hang on to is that it's the drawing of legislative district boundaries in a way to give a party or a group of voters an electoral advantage over the others. And I'm going to explain a little bit more. But it has to do with how you draw the lines around a district, a congressional district or a state district. And when it's gerrymandering, you're doing it in a way that's manipulative. You're giving an advantage to one party or one group of voters. There are different types of gerrymandering. So there could be racial gerrymandering, which means that you do it on the basis of race, so that you're giving an advantage to a race of people, but you're also discriminating against other races or ethnicities. Another type, which is what I'm going to be focusing on a little bit more, is partisan gerrymandering, where you draw the district lines to give a political party, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, an advantage. And then there's extreme gerrymandering, which means that it's not just a little gerrymandering, it's like it's done a lot of gerrymandering. And that's known as extreme gerrymandering. What I want to do is take you through two cases of extreme gerrymandering in two different states. And the first state that we'll look at is North Carolina. And the second state that we'll look at is Maryland. And I want to give you these two states for this reason. In North Carolina, we're going to see an example of extreme gerrymandering where the Republicans really, really gave it to the Democrats, and by doing the way that they did the gerrymandering. And then in the second example, when we look at Maryland, we're going to see that the Democrats really, really kind of gave it to the Republicans and how they did the gerrymandering. And my point here is that gerrymandering isn't something that one party has been doing more than the other party. It's something that both the Republicans or Democrats are doing and have been doing, equally. So I wanted to note that. Let's start. This is North Carolina. And North Carolina, this map is extreme gerrymandering. And let me explain why, discussing two key tactics that are used. So we can see here, you can see boundary lines within the state, and the red is North Carolina, the blue is, the red is the Republicans, the blue is the Democrats. North Carolina at this time, in terms of its registered voters, has a slight advantage to Republicans. It's 50% to 48%. But this is 13 different congressional districts, and the Republicans took 10 out of 13, even though they only had a slight majority. And the reason why they did this is they used two tactics that are common for extreme gerrymandering. And one tactic is called packing, and the other tactic is called cracking. And here I'm going to try to explain both. So let's take this area where you see Raleigh. That's Raleigh-Durham. And that's a Democratic stronghold area in the state. Well, if you look closely, you can see there's this little connector here. And then up here in a rectangular way, that's considered the same district. Now again, I'm focusing on congressional districts, so that district will elect one member to Congress. And each of the districts has about approximately the same number of people, about 700,000 people. But what's going on here is that the Republicans are drawing this line, and the lines for the state, and they know they're not going to win every single state, every single district. They only have a 50 to 48% advantage. But what they did is they packed Democrats in here. And the way that they packing means that you basically, kind of as the word says, you push more Democrats into that district than you would have if you just drew a more compact district. So Democrats here in this area are being packed when the lines are drawn with the Democrats in the Raleigh area and to make one district. Now what that does is that gives that Raleigh-Durham district not just a majority of Democrats, but now a supermajority. Now you might be wondering, why would the Republicans want to give more Democratic voters in there? Because by pushing them in to this area, they're yanking them out of this area. Do you see that? So they get pushed into one, but they're being yanked out of the other one. And so that means that the other one, this district here, the Republicans have a much better chance of winning because the Democrats were pushed into the other district. And that's what happened. These are the election results. Also, you can see packing going on here. I think that this district is not compact. It kind of comes out here. Democrats were packed in here. They could have been in this district if they weren't packed, which would have made this district competitive and maybe not fall into the Republicans' hands. So that's packing. Now you might wonder, well, what's so bad about packing? Well, if you're a Democrat and you live in North Carolina, you might feel, well, now my vote has been lessened. I'm not going to say that your vote never counts, but you might feel your vote is lessened. Because now you could have been, if you weren't packed, I'm sorry about that, if you weren't packed, you'd be in here in a contested district, but now whether you vote, the Democrats are going to win anyway, most likely, whether you vote or not. They're just going to win by a lot more. But you got taken out of a district where maybe it could have been a contested district and your vote could have made the difference whether a Democrat or Republican wins. So in that sense, you might feel that your vote doesn't count as much as someone else's now. So that's the concern. In addition to the packing, there's also cracking. To see cracking, you have to look very carefully at the map and look at the cities. Here we have Greensboro and Fayetteville and Winston-Salem. I think you see how it's right on the boundary, Greensboro and Fayetteville, right on the boundary. That was not a fluke. Greensboro is a Democratic stronghold, and so is Fayetteville. And let me show you this picture focused in. So is Winston-Salem. Let's take Greensboro. Okay, Greensboro, that city area, is a Democratic stronghold, and you can see it a little, it's darker red is the Greensboro area, the greater Greensboro area. You'll notice that the boundary, it runs right through the city. That was done on purpose. That's extreme gerrymandering. And the kind of gerrymandering tactic that's being used is called, the other one is called cracking. Because what you're doing, cracking means you thin out the other party. So the Democrats, half of them go in here and half of them go in here. Well, by doing that, you make it so the Republicans win both districts. Because now the Democrats are going to be outnumbered by the rest of the District 6, which is primarily Republicans. Same thing here. If you had drawn the district in a circle right around Greensboro, and Greensboro has primarily Democratic voters, who would win that election? Democrats, right? So the member of Congress would most likely be a Democrat. So it's sneaky. You run the district lines right through the city to crack them and thin them out. As I said, it's not just the Republicans doing it. It's the same thing with the Democrats. So here's Maryland. Maryland, it's the other way around. Maryland is about 65% Democrat and 35% Republican. And in this map, Maryland takes 7 out of 8 seats, 7 out of 8, which is 87.5%, even though they're only 65% Democrat voters. And it's the same ideas. Right here, I look at this map, I see the packing coming up here. This part of Maryland is primarily Republican, but here, Republicans got packed in. The Democrats did that on purpose to push them in. And then here, there's a lot of cracking going on with the creative line drawing. So I pulled out one of the districts. This is Maryland's 3rd district. I pulled it out of here. There's no official award like which district is the most gerrymandered district in the United States. They don't get an award for that. But if they did get an award, Maryland's 3rd district would win the award. It's the most gerrymandered district. And you see it looks so funny, right? Why are they doing this? Because they want to crack the Republicans. They want to thin them out. So they made sure when they drew the lines in here, which they pulled out here, they made sure that the Democrats, by drawing it this way, have a majority over the Republicans, but also they made it so the surrounding areas, which are surrounding districts like here and here and here, that the Republicans are also getting thinned out. And so the Democrats not only win that one, but also the ones around them. So it's very, very sneaky. You might wonder, well, what's so bad about that? Well, if you're a Republican and you live in Maryland, your vote got totally diluted because they drew the districts to make sure that the Democrats are going to win every single district, and except for this one, which they were going to lose anyway. So you might feel that if you live in this state, no matter where you live, that your vote doesn't count that much. It's been very, very diluted. It's kind of weakened. I want to show you a short video clip. This is the governor of Maryland, and if you were wondering, if the legislators feel bad about this, I think you'll see that they don't. So let me show you.
This farmer will one day use augmented reality to help ensure the best yield. The metaverse may be virtual, but the impact will be real.
We also had the motive, and in fact campaigned on it, that because redistricting in our country is a process that is driven by our elected officials, and currently in our country, most of them are either Democrats or Republicans. It was something that everyone was aware of in redistricting, that if there were a Republican governor, he or she would be drawing those borders in a way that was more advantageous to the Republican Party. And if we had a Democratic governor, that I would be drawing those districts in a way that was more advantageous to our party. And that's what I did, constitutionally and legally. But most of the states, I understood from having been a lifelong Democrat and having served on the Baltimore City Council for 8 years, having served as mayor, having run twice for governor, that in our state, I understood very well that the redistricting process was still a partisan process, one that provided the parameters of legality, statutory, case law, constitutional, provided those parameters were observed, that ours was a state where that partisan motive was allowable. I mean, you ask me, when did I arrive at that decision? It was not a decision I made. It was a decision that was made by those that set up the statutory process that put the pen for redistricting in the hand of whichever man or woman the people elected to be governor during that period of time in which redistricting happened.
But there did come a time.
I hope that you might have been able to see. Does he sound like, so he was the governor of Maryland when they drew the district lines that way. Did he sound like he was apologizing? No, he was just like, this is my job. And that's how the legislators feel in many cases. The same thing with North Carolina. Now, you might be wondering if at this point you're thinking, well, this doesn't sound like a very good practice. Why is this allowed? Shouldn't our Constitution be saying something about this? Shouldn't it be clear in the Constitution that this is not allowed? Not the case. So, going back to our Constitution, there's another clause. It's a little bit lesser known, but it's considered, the name it goes by is the Elections Clause. And this clause is from Article 1, Section 4. It says, the time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. And again, that's called the Elections Clause. And it's referring to, as it says, the time of the election, when it is, where it is, and just the manner of the election. My question for you, according to this clause, what entity decides the time, places, and manners of elections? You could just yell it out if you want. States, yes, state legislature, correct. So the state legislatures get to decide the rules about elections. That's why with elections in our country, different states do it differently. So you'll notice there are a lot of different rules, whether you live in California or live somewhere else, about voting and elections. It goes back to this clause, okay? So because of this, the state legislatures say that every 10 years, we get to draw the district lines. We're the ones who gets to do it. The Constitution says district lines need to be redrawn every 10 years, and we have a census every 10 years to determine the population, to decide how big the district should be. But the state legislatures say we have the power to draw those lines. But the inherent problem is that they're the ones in office, and these lines are going to affect who gets reelected, or can have an effect. So they can draw the lines to benefit themselves, or they can draw the lines to benefit their party. And so that's where the problem comes in. You also might be curious, we do have a court system. Maybe the courts will step in and say all of this is unconstitutional. Well, when we look at the Supreme Court, for example, they've ruled on gerrymandering. And they said racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. But if it's partisan gerrymandering, it's constitutional. And racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, it violates the Voting Rights Act, it violates the Equal Protection Clause. But partisan gerrymandering is constitutional. And they said for two reasons. One reason is that they said it would be very difficult for the Supreme Court to say what's a fair map and what's not a fair map. That they're not going to be able to determine what's fair and what's not fair. What do you want them to do? Strike down maps left and right all the time? How are they going to know what's fair and what's not? What's extreme and what's not? That's what the majority of justices said. And the other point they said was that it's not really the role of the courts to decide this issue of gerrymandering. It's really part of the political process. The political process should decide it, not the court stepping in. So that kind of goes a little bit to the democracy is the elected lawmakers argument, in that the lawmakers were elected, that's their job. That's part of the political process, and that's, that can be seen as kind of democracy. So, that brings me to the end, and I said that I kind of wanted to pull together this idea, or this question for us. What is it? Does it seem like gerrymandering does violate democracy? Or does it seem like it doesn't violate democracy? It's just part of the democratic process. And I have some other questions too, but that was the starting question. So that concludes my talk. Thank you for being such a polite audience. And I thought we could have a little bit of time for discussion if we have time for that. Thank you.